two titans of American music, nearly a century of combined stardom, and a relationship shrouded in whispers of rivalry, respect, and secrets held close for decades. When Tony Bennett finally spoke the unvarnished truth about Frank Sinatra at 91 years old, it wasn't just another celebrity revelation. It was the closing chapter in one of music's most misunderstood relationships. What did Bennett really think of the man who called him the best singer in the business? And why did he wait until his final years to tell the world? Tonight, we uncover what was really happening behind those immaculate suits and timeless voices. The year is 1950. America is booming with post-war prosperity. The record industry is exploding, and Frank Sinatra is fighting for his professional life. Once the idol of millions, Sinatra's career is in freefall, bleeding from a hemorrhaged vocal cord, dropped by his record label, and watching his box office appeal evaporate. At just 34, the man who once made teenage girls faint at the Paramount Theater is now being called a has-been. Meanwhile, in a New York nightclub, a young singer named Anthony Dominic Benedetto is finding his voice. Born in 1926 in Queens to Italian immigrant parents, he had returned from serving in the final bloody campaigns of World War II and decided to pursue his passion for jazz and popular music. Performing under the stage name Joe Barry, he's noticed by Bob Hope, who suggests a name change. "That's a little too long for the marquee," Hope reportedly told him. "Let's economize it and call you Tony Bennett." The name sticks, and in 1951, while Sinatra struggles, Bennett scores his first #1 hit with "Because of You." By 1953, he follows it with "Rags to Riches," another chart topper. In a remarkable twist of timing, just as Sinatra is beginning his own Phoenix-like resurrection with his Oscar-winning role in From Here to Eternity, Bennett is establishing himself as America's newest singing sensation. The parallels between them are striking. Both Italian-American men with powerful, distinctive voices, both deeply influenced by jazz phrasing while remaining accessible to mainstream audiences. Both projecting an image of masculine sophistication in an age of crew cuts and conformity. But their differences are just as pronounced. Sinatra, explosive, volatile, linked to organized crime figures, notorious for his temper and love affairs. Bennett, gentler, more reserved, a serious painter who signed his canvases with his birth name, Benedetto. Sinatra sings of saloons and broken hearts. Bennett of silver linings and leaving his heart in San Francisco. By the mid-1950s, the template is set. Sinatra is the chairman of the board, the leader of the Rat Pack, the definition of cool. Bennett is the nice guy, the romantic, the consummate professional who delivers night after night without the drama. The music press, always hungry for rivalry narratives, begins positioning them as competitors for the crown of America's premier male vocalist. The 1960s find both men facing the British invasion and the rising tide of rock and roll. Sinatra famously dismisses the new music, particularly the Beatles, as the most brutal, ugly, desperate, vicious form of expression he's ever heard. Bennett takes a different approach, adapting without compromising his standards, recording with younger artists while maintaining his commitment to the American songbook. For decades, the two giants orbit each other in the entertainment firmament, sometimes close, sometimes distant, but always aware of the other's gravitational pull. The public sees glimpses of their relationship, a nod of respect here, a compliment there. But what's really happening behind closed doors remains largely hidden, until Tony Bennett, in his 10th decade of life, finally decides to tell the world the unvarnished truth about his relationship with the voice. The public narrative was clean and simple. Two Italian-American singers who respected each other from a professional distance. Sinatra, the established legend, Bennett, the worthy successor. But beneath this manufactured storyline ran currents of complexity that neither man's publicity team was eager to reveal. The first crack in the facade came in 1965, when Frank Sinatra invited Tony Bennett to participate in the Sinatra Spectacular television special, a significant endorsement by the industry's most powerful star. During the broadcast, Sinatra introduced Bennett with words that would follow him for the rest of his career. "Tony Bennett is the best singer in the business." Coming from Sinatra, this wasn't just praise, it was anointment. But the reality behind that moment was far more complicated than it appeared. According to multiple sources close to both camps, Sinatra's endorsement wasn't just generosity, it was strategic. By 1965, Sinatra was increasingly concerned about his legacy and how he would be remembered. Having Bennett, 15 years his junior, as an ally rather than a competitor served his long-term interests. What viewers at home didn't see was what reportedly happened backstage. As revealed in later interviews with production staff, Sinatra had been drinking heavily before the broadcast and had initially forgotten Bennett was even on the schedule. The famous introduction was hastily written by a staff writer and handed to Sinatra minutes before he went on stage. The seeming spontaneity was, like so much in Hollywood, carefully constructed. For Bennett, the relationship was equally complex. While publicly expressing nothing but admiration for Sinatra, privately he struggled with being perpetually in the older singer's shadow. "Tony would never say a bad word about Frank, not to anyone," revealed Bennett's longtime pianist Ralph Sharon in a 2010 interview. But you could tell it bothered him that no matter what he achieved, the conversation always came back to Sinatra. This dynamic was reinforced by the music, industry's power structures. Sinatra's connections ran deep through record labels, radio stations, nightclub owners, and even less savory characters with ties to organized crime. Bennett, by contrast, maintained a cleaner image and reportedly refused to perform in mob-controlled venues that were Sinatra's bread and butter. This professional choice came with consequences. There were definitely doors that closed to Tony because he wouldn't play ball with certain people, claimed music producer Phil Ramone in his memoir. Doors that were always open to Frank. The financial realities reflected this imbalance. While both men sold millions of records, Sinatra's business ventures, including his founding of Reprise Records, made him wealthy beyond anything Bennett would achieve until much later in life. In 1971, when Sinatra announced his short-lived retirement, his net worth was estimated at over $30 million. Bennett, despite his hits, was earning a fraction of that and would face bankruptcy in the late 1970s as musical tastes shifted. Their personal interactions were equally misrepresented. The public saw occasional photographs of the two singers together at events, seemingly comfortable in each other's company. What remained hidden were the numerous times Sinatra allegedly refused Bennett's invitations to collaborate more substantially, or the fact that, according to multiple biographers, they rarely socialized outside of industry functions. Perhaps most telling was their divergent artistic paths. While Sinatra increasingly leaned into his tough guy persona, recording songs that emphasized his world-weary machismo, Bennett continued exploring the full emotional spectrum of the American songbook. This difference wasn't just artistic, it reflected fundamental differences in how they viewed themselves and their legacies. As Bennett's former manager Derek Bolton noted in his memoirs, Tony always felt Frank was playing a character called Frank Sinatra, while Tony was just trying to be himself. This observation would prove prescient when, decades later, Bennett finally decided to tell his truth about the man who had both blessed and shadowed his career. Number 5. The Shadow of Influence. I was never trying to be him. Tony Bennett, consistently positioned by the press as Sinatra's artistic heir apparent, carrying the torch of the Great American Songbook through decades when it fell out of mainstream favor. In 2018, during what would be one of his final in-depth interviews before his Alzheimer's diagnosis became public, Bennett addressed the comparison that had followed him for over 60 years. "The press always wanted to make it seem like I was trying to be the next Sinatra," Bennett revealed to The New Yorker. "But I was never trying to be him. I was trying to be me." Frank knew that, even if nobody else did. Bennett went on to explain that in their rare private conversations, Sinatra had acknowledged this distinction. "He told me once, 'You're doing it right, kid. You're doing it your way without trying to do it my way.' This revelation challenged decades of music journalism that had framed Bennett as Sinatra's disciple rather than a distinct artist with his own vision. It also shed new light on Sinatra's awareness of his own overwhelming influence on male vocalists of the era, and his apparent respect for those who charted their own course. What this actually shows is that behind the public personas, both men were more artistically self-aware than their carefully managed images suggested, recognizing nuances in each other's approaches that critics often missed in their rush to create narratives of succession. Number 4. The Columbia Years. He warned me, but I didn't listen. Two artists at different stages of their relationships with Columbia Records, Sinatra having departed acrimoniously in 1952 after his commercial decline, Bennett in his prime years with the label during the 1950s and 1960s. According to Bennett's 2016 memoir, Just Getting Started, Sinatra privately warned him about Columbia Records president Mitch Miller in 1956. "Frank called me out of the blue," Bennett wrote. "He said, 'Be careful with that Miller guy. He'll have you singing with animals if you let him.'" This was a reference to Miller's penchant for novelty records and gimmicky arrangements that Sinatra had resisted. Bennett admitted he dismissed the warning, believing his relationship with the label was different. "I thought I was special to them. I wasn't." By the 1970s, Columbia would pressure Bennett to record contemporary material against his artistic judgment, leading to a creative and commercial nadir that paralleled Sinatra's earlier experience. Bennett's admission revealed not only a rare moment of direct mentorship from Sinatra, but also highlighted how both men, despite their power and fame, ultimately faced similar struggles with record executives who prioritized commercial trends over artistic integrity. Bennett was eventually dropped by Columbia in 1972, just as Sinatra had been 2 decades earlier. What this actually shows is that beneath the glamour of their public personas, both men were ultimately workers in an industry that viewed them as commodities, a reality Sinatra recognized earlier and more clearly than Bennett. Number 3. The Las Vegas Truth. We lived different lives. Two headliners in the entertainment capital of America during its golden age, commanding the highest fees and filling showrooms night after night through the 1960s and 1970s. In a 2011 interview with Howard Stern that gained renewed attention after Bennett's 90th birthday, the singer spoke candidly about the Vegas years. "Everyone assumes Frank and I hung out together in Vegas, but we lived completely different lives there," Bennett explained. "He had his crowd. I had mine. His crowd stayed up until dawn. I was in bed by midnight most nights." Bennett elaborated that while Sinatra's entourage included celebrities, mobsters, and politicians, Bennett's consisted mainly of musicians with whom he would paint during the day. "Frank thought I was crazy for not enjoying the Vegas lifestyle more," Bennett recalled. "He once sent 3 showgirls to my dressing room as a joke. I thanked them politely and sent them back." This revelation contradicted the assumption that all Vegas headliners of that era participated equally in the city's notorious excesses. It positioned Bennett as a conscious outlier who maintained his artistic discipline even in an environment designed for indulgence, and suggested Sinatra recognized this difference enough to playfully challenge it. What this actually shows is that Bennett's longevity wasn't just good genetics. It was a deliberate lifestyle choice that set him apart from peers who burned brighter but shorter in the intense spotlight of mid-century fame. Number 2. The Madison Square Garden Confession. He was terrified that night. Frank Sinatra, at his massive 1974 main event comeback concert, broadcast nationwide from Madison Square Garden, with Bennett watching from the audience rather than appearing on the bill. In his 2016 memoir and subsequent interviews, Bennett revealed something no one knew about that historic night. "Frank called me the afternoon before the show," Bennett recounted. "He was terrified. This man who seemed to fear nothing told me his stomach was in knots and he wasn't sure he could go through with it." According to Bennett, Sinatra was particularly anxious about the live television aspect, fearing a vocal mishap would be witnessed by millions. He asked me if I would be willing to come backstage before the show just to talk. Of course, I said yes. Bennett described finding Sinatra pacing in his dressing room, unusually vulnerable. I just told him what he always projected, that he was Frank Sinatra and no one could touch him. Sometimes even the biggest stars need to hear that from a colleague. This account dramatically reframes one of Sinatra's most iconic performances, revealing the human vulnerability behind the confident facade. It also positions Bennett not as a competitor, but as a trusted peer whom Sinatra felt comfortable revealing his insecurities to, a dynamic never before disclosed to the public. What this actually shows is that the image of Sinatra as unshakably confident was itself a carefully maintained performance, one that even he sometimes struggled to maintain in the face of high-stakes moments. Number 1. The final phone call. What he said in the end. Two elderly artists, with Sinatra in his final years and Bennett continuing to perform and record successfully into his 70s, experiencing a career renaissance. In what would become the most poignant of Bennett's revelations, he described receiving a phone call from Sinatra just 3 weeks before Sinatra's death in May 1998. He called out of the blue, Bennett told Vanity Fair in 2019. He hadn't been well, and we both knew without saying it that this might be goodbye. According to Bennett, Sinatra spoke not about his own legacy, but about Bennett's future. He told me, "Tony, you're going to be the last one standing. You're going to carry this music forward when the rest of us are gone. Don't ever let it die." Bennett admitted being moved to tears by this unexpected passing of the torch. In all our years, with all the ups and downs, he'd never spoken to me quite like that. It wasn't about him anymore. It was about the music we both loved. This final conversation, revealed by Bennett only after he himself had reached his 90s, recontextualizes the entire relationship between the two men. It suggests that beneath the professional rivalry and personal differences, Sinatra recognized in Bennett the most dedicated curator of their shared musical tradition, and explicitly entrusted him with its preservation. What this actually shows is that beyond ego, beyond business, both men were ultimately unified by their devotion to an American art form they helped define, and Sinatra's final recognition of their shared mission may have been the greatest validation Bennett ever received. The truth about Sinatra and Bennett, the reality behind decades of public perception, is both simpler and more complex than fans ever realized. These weren't just two Italian-American singers who happened to work the same circuit. They were men bound by parallel journeys through an entertainment landscape neither of them created, but both helped define. The revelations Bennett finally shared in his final years paint a picture not of the rivalry the press craved, nor of the close friendship occasionally implied by publicists, but of something far more nuanced, a relationship of mutual recognition between two artists who understood each other's struggles and triumphs in ways no one else possibly could. What emerges most clearly is that both men recognize the prison of their public personas. Sinatra, trapped in the endless performance of being Frank Sinatra, the tough guy, the chairman, the untouchable icon who could never show weakness or indecision. Bennett, forever introduced in relation to Sinatra rather than on his own terms, carrying the weight of comparison while trying to maintain his distinct artistic identity. The final phone call Bennett described, that passing of the torch 3 weeks before Sinatra's death, reveals what may be the most important truth of all. For Sinatra, beneath the swagger and the mythology, the true priority wasn't his own legend, but the preservation of the musical tradition he had helped define. In Bennett, he saw not a rival or a copy, but the artist most likely to carry that tradition forward with authenticity and respect. As Bennett himself aged into his 90s, facing his own mortality and the cognitive decline of Alzheimer's disease, the decision to finally share these private moments makes profound sense. These weren't just stories about Frank Sinatra. They were Bennett's testimony to a musical heritage both men had served throughout their lives. By revealing the human being behind the Sinatra mythology, the insecurities, the regrets, the moments of genuine connection. Bennett wasn't diminishing his former colleague, but completing the picture for posterity. The most powerful revelation may be the simplest. Behind the carefully managed images, the press narratives, and the public performances. These were two men who recognized in each other something essential about themselves and the musical tradition they both served. Not rivals, not quite friends, but something perhaps more meaningful. Witnesses to each other's journeys through the stratosphere of American celebrity and guardians of a musical tradition they both cherished above their individual success. When Tony Bennett began sharing these more intimate revelations about his relationship with Sinatra in the latter part of his life, particularly between 2016 and 2019, the response was both immediate and complex. The Sinatra estate, typically protective of Frank's legacy, made no public objection to Bennett's accounts. This silence was widely interpreted as tacit confirmation, particularly given how Bennett's stories humanized rather than scandalized the older singer. Music historians and biographers found themselves reassessing decades of assumptions about the relationship between the two icons. Bennett's revelations don't contradict the historical record so much as they add crucial emotional context, noted jazz critic Ted Gioia in a 2019 essay. They help us understand that beneath the public performances of rivalry or collegiality, there was something more nuanced at work. For younger generations discovering these artists through streaming services and reissues, Bennett's stories created a new entry point into understanding not just Sinatra as a person, but the entire mid-century entertainment ecosystem both men navigated. Record sales for both artists saw modest bumps following Bennett's more revealing interviews, suggesting renewed interest in their catalogs. Perhaps most significantly, Bennett's decision to share these stories coincided with his own final act as a performing artist. In 2014, at age 88, he released Cheek to Cheek with Lady Gaga, which debuted at #1 on the Billboard charts, making him the oldest artist ever to achieve a #1 album. His revelations about Sinatra came during this late-career renaissance, as he found himself the last standing giant of his era, precisely as Sinatra had predicted. In 2021, Bennett's family revealed that he had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease in 2016, meaning many of these Sinatra revelations were shared during the early stages of his cognitive decline, as he worked to secure his legacy and share important truths before they faded from his memory. This context added poignancy to his recollections, particularly the story of Sinatra's final phone call entrusting him with carrying their shared musical tradition forward. Bennett's final public performances came in August 2021, when, at age 95, and despite his advancing Alzheimer's, he performed 2 sold-out shows at Radio City Music Hall with Lady Gaga. Critics noted that while he sometimes appeared confused between songs, once the music started, the decades of professional discipline took over. He performed standards from the American Songbook, the very tradition Sinatra had entrusted him to preserve, with remarkable clarity and emotional depth. In a touching symmetry, just as Sinatra had publicly proclaimed Bennett the best singer in the business in 1965, Lady Gaga repeatedly deferred to Bennett on stage in 2021, introducing him to new audiences as one of the greatest vocalists of all time. The torch that Sinatra had passed to Bennett was being passed again, ensuring the continuation of a musical lineage. Tony Bennett died on July 21, 2023 at age 96, having outlived Sinatra by 25 years, truly the last one standing of their generation, just as Sinatra had predicted. In the flood of tributes that followed, his complex relationship with Sinatra featured prominently, with many citing the revelations he had shared in his final years as evidence of a deeper connection than the public had ever realized between these two towering figures of American music. What the Sinatra-Bennett relationship ultimately reveals isn't just a footnote in music history. It's a profound lesson about the nature of artistic legacy and the burden of public personas. These were two men who, despite their differences in temperament and lifestyle, recognized in each other something essential: the weight of carrying an entire musical tradition through decades of changing tastes and cultural shifts. Their relationship challenges our cultural tendency to flatten complex human connections into simple narratives of rivalry or friendship. The truth Bennett finally revealed was neither. It was a recognition between two artists that transcended both competition and camaraderie. They were, in many ways, the only people who could truly understand each other's unique position in American cultural life. Perhaps the most powerful lesson lies in how Bennett waited until his final years to share these truths. Not out of fear or calculation, but because some understandings can only be articulated when one has reached the vantage point of a life fully lived. It took Bennett 9 decades to fully comprehend and articulate what his relationship with Sinatra had meant, not just to him personally, but to the preservation of the great American songbook they both served. In an era of immediate reaction and constant oversharing, there's something profoundly moving about truths revealed only after long reflection, offered not as gossip or self-aggrandizement, but as a final gift to history and to the audiences who had supported both men throughout their remarkable journeys. If this story of Tony Bennett and Frank Sinatra tells us anything, it's that the most meaningful connections in our lives aren't always the ones that fit neatly into categories. Sometimes it's the complex relationships, not quite friendship, not quite rivalry, that shape us most profoundly. What do you think? Was Bennett right to wait until his final years to share these revelations, or should he have spoken his truth sooner? If you appreciated this deeper look beyond the headlines and public personas, hit subscribe for more stories that explore the complex realities behind our cultural icons. And remember, sometimes the most important truths are the ones that take a lifetime to understand.